Sergeant First Class Emily Garcia stood at attention in the blazing South Carolina sun, sweat already beading on her forehead, despite the early 8 a.m. formation time at Fort Jackson. Around her, 32 other soldiers maintained perfect military bearing, their freshly pressed uniforms crisp against the backdrop of the training field. But Emily felt different from the rest, like an imposter wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. Which city are you watching from? Share it in the comments. Maybe someone else from your city is here too. And if you believe heroes can appear in the most unexpected ways, hit subscribe and give this video a like. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez paced in front of the formation, his combat boots crunching against the gravel. His eyes swept over each soldier before landing on Emily. She could feel the weight of his disapproval, the same look she'd received from every instructor since arriving at Fort Jackson for the third time in 18 months. "Garcia?" Rodriguez barked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "You're with Second Squad for combat lifesaver training. Try not to embarrass yourself like you did during weapons handling yesterday." A few soldiers snickered quietly. Emily's face burned with shame, but she kept her eyes forward. Yesterday's incident with the M4 carbine had been yet another in a long series of failures that marked her as the platoon's weak link. She'd fumbled the magazine insertion, dropped the weapon during clearing procedures, and somehow managed to jam the bolt carrier group during routine maintenance. For someone supposedly holding the rank of Sergeant First Class, her performance was beyond embarrassing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. How did someone with her rank end up back in basic training? Why couldn't she perform basic soldier skills that privates mastered in weeks? What was wrong with her? The formation broke up, and Emily trudged toward the medical training area where Second Squad was setting up for combat lifesaver certification. The exercise involved treating simulated battlefield injuries under time pressure, something that should have been second nature to any soldier with her supposed experience. But as Emily approached the training stations, her hands began to tremble slightly. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and fresh from civilian life, looked at Emily with barely concealed confusion. "Sergeant, you okay? You look kind of pale." Emily nodded curtly. "I'm fine, Private. Focus on your training." The truth was far more complicated than anyone at Fort Jackson could imagine. Emily Garcia wasn't her real name, and the story of how she'd ended up repeating basic training for the third time was classified at levels that would make most officers' security clearances worthless. But standing there in the South Carolina heat, watching teenagers master skills she pretended to struggle with, Emily wondered if she'd made the right choice in accepting this assignment. The combat lifesaver training began with Drill Sergeant Martinez demonstrating proper tourniquet application on a simulated leg wound. Emily watched carefully, not because she needed to learn the technique, but because she had to remember to perform it slowly enough to maintain her cover as an incompetent soldier struggling with basic skills. "Garcia, you're up," Martinez called out, pointing to the training dummy. "Show us how to apply a tourniquet to a severed femoral artery. You have 90 seconds. Emily approached the dummy, her movements deliberately clumsy. She picked up the tourniquet with shaking hands, appearing to struggle with the windlass mechanism. Around her, other soldiers watched with a mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment. This was supposed to be their squad leader, someone with years of experience, and she was failing at basic first aid. 60 seconds into the exercise, Emily was still fumbling with the tourniquet placement. Martinez shook his head in disgust. "Time, Garcia, that wounded soldier would have bled out twice over. Private Johnson, show her how it's done." The 19-year-old private stepped forward and expertly applied the tourniquet in under 30 seconds. The contrast was stark and humiliating. Emily stepped back, her face flushed with manufactured shame. Inside, she was calculating wind speed, ambient temperature, and the exact pressure required for the tourniquet to be effective in real combat conditions, but none of that knowledge could show. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Martinez said to the assembled squad. "Rank doesn't mean anything if you can't perform basic soldier tasks. Garcia, you need to decide if you're serious about being in this army or if you're just wasting everyone's time." The words stung because they were designed to. Emily had volunteered for this humiliation, but that didn't make it any easier to endure. She nodded silently and moved to the back of the group as training continued. But then everything changed in an instant that nobody saw coming. The accident happened during the afternoon urban warfare simulation. Second Squad was practicing building clearing techniques in the mock village that Fort Jackson used for realistic combat training. The structures were built to withstand repeated training exercises, but one of the older buildings had developed structural weaknesses that hadn't been detected during routine inspections. Emily's squad was moving through a simulated house-to-house search when Private Martinez kicked in what appeared to be a standard training door. Instead of swinging open as designed, the door and a section of the surrounding wall collapsed inward. The sudden structural failure triggered a cascade effect that brought down a significant portion of the building's second floor. 6 soldiers were trapped under concrete blocks, wooden beams, and twisted metal framework. Their screams echoed through the training area as dust clouds billowed into the afternoon air. The weight of the debris was too much for the remaining squad members to move safely, and the trapped soldiers were beginning to show signs of crush injuries and respiratory distress. Drill Sergeant Martinez immediately called for medical evacuation and engineering support, but the nearest heavy equipment was 20 minutes away. The medics could treat exposed injuries, but they couldn't safely extract soldiers who were pinned under structural debris weighing several thousand pounds. "We need to get them out now," Martinez shouted over the chaos. "But if we move the wrong beam, the whole thing could collapse further." That's when Emily stepped forward, her demeanor completely transformed. "Sergeant Martinez," she said, her voice calm and authoritative in a way that made everyone turn to look at her. "I need you to clear all personnel back 50 feet and establish a security perimeter. Radio for dust-off medical evacuation with trauma capability, not ground transport." Martinez stared at her. This wasn't the fumbling, incompetent soldier who'd failed at basic tasks all morning. This was someone speaking with the confidence of real experience. "Garcia, what are you talking about? You can barely tie your boots correctly." Emily was already moving toward the collapsed structure, her eyes analyzing the debris pattern with professional precision. "Private Johnson, I need you to gather every poncho liner, sleeping bag, and tarp you can find. Private Williams, get me 50 feet of 550 cord and every carabiner from the climbing gear. Private Chen, find me a vehicle jack from the motor pool." The soldiers looked at Martinez uncertainly. These weren't the instructions of someone who struggled with basic tasks. These were the orders of someone who knew exactly what she was doing in a crisis situation. "Do what she says," Martinez ordered, something in Emily's tone convincing him to trust her instincts. Emily approached the debris pile and dropped to her hands and knees, analyzing the structural collapse with the eye of someone who had seen similar situations before. The concrete blocks were supporting most of the weight, but a series of wooden support beams were creating pressure points that were slowly crushing the trapped soldiers. She needed to redistribute the load without triggering further collapse. Working with mechanical precision, Emily began creating a system of anchored supports using the gear her squad had gathered. She wrapped 5,550 cord around stable portions of the remaining structure, creating anchor points that could bear significant weight. Then she began using the vehicle jack to slowly lift key support beams, taking pressure off the trapped soldiers while simultaneously sliding makeshift cribbing into place to maintain the new load distribution. "Garcia," Martinez said quietly, watching her work, "where did you learn to do this?" Emily didn't look up from her task. "Long story, Sergeant. Right now I need you to coordinate with medical when they arrive. Tell them we have possible internal injuries, crush syndrome, and respiratory compromise from dust inhalation." 30 minutes later, all 6 trapped soldiers had been safely extracted and were being transported to the base hospital. Emily had created a mechanical advantage system that allowed the squad to move debris weighing over 2 tons without causing further structural collapse. The medics had arrived to find the casualties already properly triaged and receiving appropriate first aid. Drill Sergeant Martinez stood beside Emily as they watched the last helicopter disappear toward Colombia. "Okay, Garcia, time to explain who you really are." Emily looked around at her squad, all of whom were staring at her with new respect and deep confusion. The woman who had struggled to apply a tourniquet that morning had just orchestrated a complex rescue operation with the skill of a combat engineer. "I can't tell you everything, Sergeant," Emily said finally, "but I can tell you that my name really is Emily Garcia, and I really am a Sergeant First Class in the United States Army." Martinez crossed his arms. "And the rest of it?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much she could reveal. "I was part of a classified unit that specialized in urban combat and structural operations. My last assignment ended badly, and I needed to start over. The only way to get a clean slate was to go through the system from the beginning. Special Forces? Emily shook her head. Adjacent to Special Forces, same mission complexity, different operational parameters. She looked at Martinez directly. Everything you've seen from me the past 6 weeks has been an act. I was ordered to maintain a low profile and avoid drawing attention to my actual capabilities. Private Johnson stepped forward, his voice filled with awe. So you really know how to do all this stuff? The weapons handling, the medical training, everything? Emily smiled for the first time since arriving at Fort Jackson. Johnson, I could field strip an M4 blindfolded and reassemble it in under 40 seconds. I could apply a tourniquet while taking enemy fire. I've done both of those things in actual combat. Martinez shook his head slowly. Why? Why put yourself through this humiliation? Why let us think you were incompetent? Emily's expression grew serious. Because sometimes the best way to hide is in plain sight. Sometimes you need people to underestimate you until the moment when it really matters. She gestured toward where the collapsed building had been. Today it mattered. 2 days later, Emily found herself standing in the office of Colonel Patterson, the commanding officer of Fort Jackson's training brigade. Also present was a civilian woman in a dark suit, who introduced herself only as Ms. Reynolds from the Department of Defense. Sergeant Garcia, Colonel Patterson began, your actions during the training accident saved 6 soldiers from potentially fatal injuries. The engineering assessment indicates that without your intervention, the secondary collapse would have occurred within minutes. Mr. Reynolds opened a file folder. Your cover assignment has been compromised, obviously. The question now is what happens next. Emily sat at attention. Ma'am, I serve at the pleasure of my commanders. If my mission here is complete, I await new orders. Colonel Patterson studied her personnel file, which Emily knew contained only carefully crafted half-truths. Your actual military record is impressive, Sergeant. Multiple combat deployments, specialized training certifications, and commendations for actions that I'm not cleared to read about. However, Ms. Reynolds interjected, your psychological evaluation from your previous assignment indicates that you've been struggling with the transition back to conventional military service after extended special operations deployments. Emily nodded. Yes, ma'am. The adjustment has been challenging. Mr. Schurz leaned forward. The incompetence you've been displaying isn't entirely an act, is it? You've been genuinely struggling with basic tasks because your mind is calibrated for complex operations. Simple procedures feel foreign after years of high-intensity missions. Emily was quiet for a long moment. It was true. After 3 years of classified operations where every decision carried life-or-death consequences, the routine tasks of basic military service felt almost impossible to focus on. Her brain was wired for crisis management, not peacetime training. That's correct, ma'am, Emily admitted. I volunteered for this assignment because I thought starting over from the beginning might help me readjust to normal military service. But the simple tasks felt meaningless when I knew I could perform at a much higher level. Colonel Patterson nodded, understanding. Classic reverse culture shock. You're not the first special operations soldier we've seen with this issue. He closed her file. The question is, what do we do with you now? Ms. Reynolds spoke up. We have a proposal. The Army is developing a new program for transitioning special operations personnel back to conventional units. It's designed to help soldiers like you who have skills that are too valuable to waste, but who need structured reintegration. Emily raised an eyebrow. What kind of program? You would become a special instructor for advanced combat training, Colonel Patterson explained. Not basic training, but specialized courses for soldiers who are already experienced. Urban warfare, combat life-saving under extreme conditions, crisis leadership, the kind of training that draws on your actual expertise. Emily considered this. And my cover story? Miss Reynolds smiled. The truth, with some redactions. You're a combat veteran with specialized experience who needed time to readjust to conventional military service. Your struggles with basic training were real, but they were the result of overqualification, not incompetence. 3 months later, Emily stood in front of a class of experienced sergeants and staff sergeants at Fort Jackson's Advanced Combat Training Facility. Instead of struggling with basic tasks, she was teaching complex urban warfare techniques to soldiers who had already proven themselves competent. The key to structural assessment during urban combat, she explained to her students, is understanding that every building collapse follows predictable engineering principles. Today, we're going to practice rapid debris clearance and casualty extraction under time pressure. Drill Sergeant Martinez, who had requested assignment as her assistant instructor, smiled as he watched Emily demonstrate advanced techniques with the confidence she'd always possessed but been forced to hide. After class, Martinez approached her. "You know, Garcia, I always knew there was something different about you, the way you held yourself, the way your eyes tracked movement during training. You moved like someone who had seen real combat." Emily nodded. "The hardest part wasn't pretending to be incompetent. The hardest part was accepting that I needed help adjusting back to normal life." She gestured toward her classroom. "This feels right, teaching instead of hiding." Martinez looked at her seriously. "Those 6 soldiers you saved that day, they put in for you to receive a commendation. Did you know that?" Emily shook her head. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "That's exactly what heroes always say," Martinez replied. "The difference is, now you don't have to pretend to be anything other than who you really are." As Emily locked up her classroom and headed toward her quarters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had failed basic training twice, but not because she lacked ability. She had failed because she had too much ability for the simple tasks she was being asked to perform. Sometimes the greatest challenge isn't learning new skills, but learning how to use the skills you already have in a different context. Emily Garcia had learned that lesson the hard way, but she had learned it completely. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Private Johnson, who had graduated from basic training and was now stationed at Fort Hood. "Sergeant Garcia, just wanted you to know that everything you taught us about staying calm in emergencies probably saved my buddy's life during a training accident here. Thank you for showing us what real leadership looks like." Emily smiled as she put her phone away. She wasn't hiding anymore, and she wasn't pretending to be less than she was. She was finally exactly where she belonged, using her experience to make other soldiers better prepared for whatever challenges they might face. The woman who had failed basic training twice had become one of the Army's most effective instructors, proving that sometimes failure is just success waiting for the right moment to reveal itself.